Today, I want to talk about choices and really becoming aware of the choices that we have. I usually write down the things that I want to talk about in these videos, and this time I felt a very intuitive pull to talk about choices without really having a lot of framework as to what exactly I want to talk about. So before I started recording, I closed my eyes and I just kind of asked for guidance for whatever needs to come through. Because I think that it is a subject that is very recurrent in my life, feeling like I have no choices, or the feeling of being stuck or trapped in a situation. Which is the reason why I think freedom, the idea of freedom, has always driven me. One of the stories that my mom always tells about me is that when I was like 2 years old, just barely talking, barely walking, I didn't like something that she told me I needed to do, kind of like to follow a rule. And I packed my bags and I said that I was going to leave the house because I didn't like her rules. And when I was 16 years old, when I graduated from high school, I decided that I wanted to leave my house, and I came to the United States, and I've lived here ever since. So this drive to be independent has always been very strong for me. And I feel like it is a drive towards that sensation of freedom. My mom used to be a very strict person. She grew up with a father that was very fearful. Mental health has been a huge kind of thing in my family, which has been both beautiful, a blessing, because I feel like this is the reason why, since I was very little, I was very interested in learning about the mind and mental health in general. And at the same time, of course, it is the thing that my mom has had to work with. My aunts, everyone in my family has kind of had to navigate this. And my brother and I as well. So all this to say that my mom kind of adopted a lot of this fear-based perspectives of the world and how things could go and unfold. So my mom was very strict, and from my perspective, back then I would call her very controlling. So I would always want to experience freedom, and that to me meant being far away from that person, which was kind of creating the structure for me. It is very interesting that this is the story that I've decided to begin this video with. But like I said, I decided that I wanted to be guided, and this seems to be what needs to come through. The reason why I find it so interesting is because choices is what I want to talk about in this video, and becoming aware of the choices that we have, which I have come to understand or feel like is the closest experience to freedom that I have. So the ability to notice and recognize the choices that I have, and the freedom that I have to choose one of those options, is what allows me to feel like I have freedom. And this can go as deep as free will. I feel like free will is a lot more simple than we conceptualize it. And I've mentioned in one of the videos that I recorded before that I believe that the human experience, that capacity to self-realization, is through the transcending of the animal instinct. So the programming. And for this to happen, we need to become aware of the choices that we have. Basically, we have to become aware of what is the programming. As animals, as mammals, what are those intrinsic programmings that are driving us? And what other options do we have once we become aware of that? So in that awareness, in that space that we can create and then see things how they are, I believe is where we can find that sense of freedom. And like I said before, that is where free will comes into play, in my opinion. It is understanding that there's an underlying programming that is usually driving everything. And then once I separate myself a little bit from that and I realize that I have choices, then I can have my own choice to go in whatever direction. This went way deeper than I thought it was going to go, but I want to bring it back to the simple idea that we have choices, and that in that realization, we can experience a sense of freedom. So what I want to talk about is, how do we even begin to realize that we have choices? Because a lot of times we feel stuck, we feel trapped. And I do want to acknowledge that there are situations for many people on the planet that could feel like that, could feel like physically there is no option, there's no way out. And for those that are suffering something like that, I hold my hand in my heart and I really think of them. And I pray that life can bring them a different situation. In this video, I am addressing something that is a lot more mental, that is in our thoughts, that we are staying trapped or stuck. I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about how I've come to realize and understand that I do have options, that I do have choices available, and that I have that capacity to choose. And to get there, we definitely have to do some work and take some responsibility for that which life has given us, which is consciousness and being conscious of those options. So how do we even begin to recognize these choices? I think I want to begin with the fact that storytelling is a huge part of the human experience. And that is going to be reflected at a macro level and at a micro level, meaning at a collective and at an individual level. So why storytelling? Why do I even want to start there? So psychologically speaking, there's been a lot of research done on the fact that the way that we perceive our life, so individually, the way that we perceive our life has everything to do with the meaning we gave to the experiences that we had. So it's not just what happened to us. It's not just the situation itself. It's the meaning that we gave that. And I find that this is where storytelling comes to play. Storytelling is ultimately how we are going to tell the story of us, how we're going to tell the story of us as a collective society, and of course also as an individual. So the recognition that the story that we're telling ourselves about our life is basically showing us the meaning that we have given to the experiences that we have accumulated in our life. That story holds the energy of what we're carrying with us. And basically, because the brain is this beautiful machine that is always comparing the past and the future, is always time traveling. It is always a step ahead and a step behind, because it is trying to make sense of what is going to happen next. But it's only making that assumption based on what has happened. And what has happened is driven by the story that we have been telling ourselves of what happened to us. I find this very interesting because when I think about it, I grew up with my brother, who is 18 months older than me. So not even 2 years older than me, right? And we lived in the same house, lived with the same parents. We, even for a long period of time, we went to the same school. So a lot of our life was very similar, right? So our caregivers were the same. We can argue that they had the same similar way to parent and care for us. Yet when we talk about our experiences and how we have made sense of the situations and experiences that we had, we have very different stories. Sometimes similar, sometimes very different. So when I think about this, what it allows me to understand is that perhaps my story could have different angles. The situation that I was in could have different angles and different perspectives and different ways of understanding it. And if that happened in the past, that could possibly happen in the future as well. Meaning, if I allow myself to step aside from the story that I have been telling myself, and I can see this story and this unfolding and these situations and these experiences from a different perspective, maybe just the simple fact that I stepped aside and I started to look at it from a different perspective is going to allow me to tell a different story, which in turn is going to allow for the story to unfold in different ways, meaning is going to give me other options, other choices to be aware of. So ultimately, what I think about this is that it's almost like the story of our lives is like this river that is always flowing, because as long as we are alive, things are happening, things are in motion. And even if we are just staying home breathing, there are things that are happening, at a physiological level, at a psychological level. Things are always happening and things are constantly in motion. And for us to be able to recognize that we are always in this river, but that we can potentially have the capacity to step aside and to see how the river is flowing, and then notice that perhaps we have different options. That when we are just kind of like going down this river, it seems like there's no options, there's no choices. But when we step aside, and that we can see that there's different streams to this river, that it maybe breaks in different ways, and there's a way here, another way here. There's moments where we can stop in a little rock and whatnot. Then we become aware of all of these options that we do have. But because of the constant motion of this place that we find ourselves in, the story that we've been telling ourselves of our life and the experiences that we've had, we are so single focused on this little track that we're not able to see the other possibilities. So how do we become aware of these choices? So the first step is recognizing that there's a story that we've been telling ourselves about our lives. And that story is based on the meaning that we have given to the situations that we have experienced. So how we made sense of everything that happened to us. And how do we even become aware of this story? Well, therapy is one of those tools that we have, right? Therapy, a lot of people that don't believe in therapy would say like, oh, what do you do there? You just go there and talk, and you have to pay someone to listen to you talk. Yes, and there's a beautiful gift that we get out of that. We are able to find the space, carve the time in our busy lives to actually recognize what is the story that we have been telling ourselves about our lives. If maybe therapy is not accessible to us in this moment for multitude of reasons, journaling is something that I've personally been doing for a long time, and that I have found is the way in which I've been able to really become aware of the story that I tell myself about my life. Not only I can go back and see and read my journal and see like, oh, well, this is what I thought about this is how I felt this day. But also even just every single day when I sit down to write in my journal at night, I can recognize that, well, there's many things that happen in one day. And if I'm taking my time to write about one specific thing, it's because I consider that important enough for me to be writing about it. So there's something special about that one situation. It could have been the most boring thing that happened throughout my day. It could have been the most mundane thing. But if I'm writing about it, it's because there's something within me that considers that important. And that, of course, is going to start telling me a lot more about the story. Like, okay, who are the characters? What are the pillars of the story that I'm telling? Meaning, well, what do I value? If I am taking the time to write about this story or this one thing, this situation that happened to me, this is telling me that I value this thing. If it was something mundane, well, maybe I value these very small interactions that I happen to have throughout my day with something or someone random. So the practice of journaling is going to be beautiful to start to recognize the story that we're telling ourselves. Another way that we could become aware of the story that we tell about ourselves is through relationships, is through the conversations that we have with the people that allow us to feel safe and secure enough that we can be authentically ourselves, meaning that we can open ourselves and really talk about what is important to us, right? But if I am in a relationship in which I know I am not allowed to talk about certain things, then that relationship is really not allowing myself to know about my story, to know about me. And, there's a place and time for different relationships. Not every single relationship, at least in my opinion, is meant to be one where I can talk about everything. But it's important to recognize which relationship, which person allows us to feel comfortable enough so that we can speak fully what we are feeling and what is important to us. And then in that talk and that conversation that I have, then I can begin to recognize the story that I'm telling myself. Now, once we have become aware of our story, the story that we've been carrying with us, this river that has been carrying us in this river of life, then the next step to recognizing that we have options and that we have choices is to take that step aside or outside of that constant motion, right? But first we need to become aware that we are in a river, that we are carrying a story, that we are responsible for that story because it's the one that we have been telling ourselves. So it is my story. And like I said, it is not about what has happened, it's about the meaning that we have given that. So that is one of the first choices that we have. What is the meaning that we are giving this story? So today I may become aware of the story that I've been telling myself about my identity as a Colombian person in the United States. And that is the story that I've been telling myself because I have been given meaning to everything that has happened to me or to the aspect of myself that is the Colombian Natalia that lives in the United States. So once I've recognized that I have been telling a story about this aspect of myself, I can take even more responsibility for that and I can take a step aside. And I can see that from a different perspective. So there's this river that has been carrying all of the stories and all of the things that I have made sense of the Natalia that is Colombian, that is in the United States. If I allow myself to step aside from that and to see that from a different perspective, I can then begin to inquire where and when perhaps I gave meaning to something that happened to this aspect of myself, that maybe there's a different choice, maybe there's a different option, maybe there's a different perspective that I didn't think about before. The ability to ask those questions can only happen when we give ourselves this space, to actually ask the questions. So it is only going to happen when we step out of this river and we start to look around and see that there's many more things happening around me. There's many more things and many more ways where this river could go to. Those questions can only happen in that moment. In this space, I like to think about as the space of curiosity. And to me, curiosity is in many ways a synonym of freedom, because it is that capacity that we have to see things not from one single focus and one single perspective, but from many different angles. And it is in that capacity to look around and to see that things can be very different than what I have made sense of. Then I can find many options and I can find that I have choices. And that sensation, that feeling of like I am not just this thing, I can look around and I can actually take a breath, is the closest I have felt to freedom. So, how do we start to become aware of the choices that we have? Becoming aware of our story. And we can have many different stories for the many different aspects of who we are. That's why I wanted to give an example with one aspect of who Natalia is. I believe that we are layers and layers of different personalities and different aspects of ourselves. And every single one of those aspects, in a way, takes shape when the story that we have been telling is very strong. Then the second step to start to recognize the choices that we have is to take a step aside from the story, to start to look at the story from a different angle. And how do we allow ourselves to take a step aside from this story that we've been telling ourselves? So I mentioned before in the first one, to become aware of our story is, therapy, journaling, talking to someone. And I didn't mention meditation before as a tool to become aware of our stories. It is definitely a tool that, at least for me, has been huge to become familiar with my thoughts and thought patterns, which in turn have shed some light to the stories that I've been telling myself. And in this second step of creating some distance from the story, meditation has been huge for me. Although it is not the only practice, it is not the only tool that is going to help us take a step aside from the story that we've been telling ourselves. You hear me talk about meditation a lot because meditation is the tool that has helped me in so many different areas of my life. It's not only the one where I have individually experienced that, but it's also in the one that I have trained with, so I can somewhat educate you from the tools that I have gathered, the things that I have understood and learned about meditation, not just from my subjective experience, but also from what science has been showing us that meditation is able to do at a brain level, at a psychological level, at a somatic and physiological level. So why does meditation help us to take a step aside from the story? So basically, when we start to meditate, there's something that we start to notice and to realize, which I quickly mentioned before. We start to become familiar of our thoughts. And when I am able to see my thoughts, hear my thoughts, I am able to recognize that I am not my thoughts. So that is one of the first steps to kind of like taking a step outside of this river that is constantly flowing. That is the story that we've been telling ourselves of who we are. Now, like I said before, meditation is not going to be the only practice, the only way. Some of us are going to have that experience painting, creating art, maybe practicing a sport, doing yoga, swimming, many different ways, just taking a walk in nature. So there's many ways in which we can take time to recognize that that constant chatter, that constant thought pattern is carrying something within, but it's not necessarily me. So that moment in which we can distance ourselves and then we can begin to ask questions, which again, to me, questions are curiosity in action, then I can start to begin to recognize that I have choices. And that maybe the story that I've been telling myself that is very rigid, very one-focused, very linear, can actually have many different ways and routes. And it is in that moment that we can start to notice also that we have the capacity to surrender, to let go, and to be flexible. All of these things that I just mentioned, letting go, surrendering, being flexible, are terms that are constantly talked about in personal growth and spirituality. Letting go and surrender, especially in spirituality. And the reason why is because in the moment that we become aware of all of those options and we get more flexible with the story that we've been telling ourselves, and we allow room for other possibilities, and in a way we surrender and let go of the story that we have been telling, then we can find that freedom. And it's in this freedom that we can also recognize that life is so abundant, because there are so many different options, there are so many different choices. But when we are so single focused, it seems like there's no more options. It seems like there's no more choices. And I feel like this is where a part of me that is somewhat rebellious has really come handy, because in many ways, the culture that we live in has made things very black and white and very linear. And in that approach, it seems very difficult to find options, to find choices, because there's always a way in which we should be doing things. Our lives should look X, Y, and Z. If you grow up, this is how you're supposed to grow up. This is how family is supposed to look like. This is how success is supposed to look like. Things seem very, very narrow. So, of course, when we are constantly reminded of that in our culture, it seems like we have no options, like we have no choice, because there's only one concept of what it should look like. So that rebellious side of me to say, wait, I think that there's more options. Going back to the moment I wanted to run away from my mom's house, whether that was when I was 2 or 16, I was actually running away from that experience of there's only one way to do things. And I'm not trying to talk about discipline here. I'm not saying that parents are wrong or anything like that. I am just using this experience that I had to make sense of my own story. So I've been wanting to do this since I was very little. I've been wanting to recognize that there's other options, that freedom does exist in many ways when I become aware of the stories that I've been telling myself. That in many ways, the sensation and the feeling and the experience of freedom comes from my understanding of my mind, of my mindset, of my thoughts, of my beliefs, of the ideas that I'm carrying with me, and the meaning that I have given to everything that has happened to me. So again, I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. I am talking about a more psychological experience of freedom. And I can argue that that psychological state is going to start to reflect in many ways in our actual physical reality. So that experience of having choices and to feel as though that is somewhat freedom can only come to us and can only be experienced to the degree that we are willing to surrender the story that we have been carrying with us, to the degree that we are willing to invite curiosity to our lives, to ask ourselves questions. Can the meaning of what I gave this situation in my life change in any way? If someone else was there, is there a different angle or perspective that perhaps that person could adopt or see this from, that would allow my story to become a little more flexible and in turn give myself more options? And then when I have that position in which I can see more options, that gives me power. That gives me the sense of liberation of this thing that I've been carrying with me. And something that is very important to acknowledge is that the expectations that we are placing in the way that life should unfold in the future is fully based on the story that we have been carrying. So again, to the degree that we are willing to surrender that story and to be flexible, we will open different doors to life to unfold in different ways. So in the moment that we surrender a story, we're also surrendering our expectations, because our expectations are almost like a flashlight that is directly coming from the story that we have been carrying with us. And the last thing that I would like to add before wrapping up this video is that, as usual, there's an ingredient that is always important to cultivate and to practice when we start to become aware of ourselves, of the stories, our values, our beliefs, our ideas, and everything that we have kind of like created as our identity, or that we have adopted to create our identity, is the ingredient of compassion. When I extend this invitation by sharing the way in which I have become aware of the story and the way that I have been able to step aside and question the story so that I can experience the sensation of freedom when I have choices, is an invitation that is also asking you to give yourself some love and some compassion. There's a part of us that is going to tend to judge the way that we have been making sense of our story. And that is not the point at all. The point is not to judge our stories. The point is not to judge ourselves. Is not to become harsh on who we are today, or even to look back and think that we were stupid for seeing or feeling in a certain way. Not at all. It's completely the opposite. It's to give all of those moments, situations, aspects of ourselves the love that they've always needed. And the only way in which we are going to trap ourselves again is by judging what we are noticing, because then that becomes very narrow focused again. Because that implies that there is only one way in which we should have been, or that we should think about this story. Judging is really coming from a place of knowing what's right and what's wrong. And the whole point of this exercise and this practice is to recognize that there's more than right and wrong, that there's more than black and white. Like I said before, culturally, we are so used to that binary story, but in reality, there's a rainbow of options out there. And ideally, this practice will invite us to recognize that there's not one side or the other, that there's actually millions of options in front of us to choose from. So I hope that this video today can help you in any way. I'm gonna have to go back and edit this video and listen to what I was guided with, and I don't even know if it made sense. So I love you very much, and I will see you in the next video.